excited to turn the tables on you because I've had the pleasure of speaking with you on A Little More Good twice now. So I'm really excited to talk to you, Dean, and learn a little bit more about who you are and what makes you tick. And I have to admit that I listened to your episode of A Little More Good and I was blown away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's so good to be here. And yeah, it is. I was telling a friend earlier this morning, I was just saying oh yeah, I'm going on this podcast with my friend Desiree. I was like, normally she has really interesting people, like nutritionists and people who have all these cool things. And I was like, I guess maybe a lot of people said no, or because it's the holiday, you got me. But I'm just kidding. I'm so pumped to be here. It's so awesome. Thank you for extending the invitation.
I was going to say you are a most interesting person indeed, my friend.
Perhaps. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, and it's something that I think in listening to you speak, I feel like I have more confidence bringing about as a topic on this podcast, because my vision for this podcast is really to talk about all sorts of things relating to, our health and our wellness. And I think that our connection to faith and to spirituality is a really important piece of that. And it's just such a challenging topic to talk about because we all come from such varied backgrounds and we all have such different experiences of, faith or religion in our lives. And so I'm so excited for everyone to hear your take on things and how you came to, in particular, the Christian faith, because you grew up without religion in your house.
That's right. Yeah. I just was it wasn't the spirituality, religion, it wasn't anything that we practiced or did. I can remember the first time I ever went to a church. I was probably 6 or 7, and it was for a funeral. And there was the priest at the front, or the pastor or whatever, but he just had his big robes on and seemed scary and intimidating. And I just kind of thought I guess that's kind of what God is. And it seemed so stuffy and just it was a funeral, so it wasn't fun. Yeah. And I just remember having this this takeaway of I don't know, not for me. And of course, growing up in the Lower Mainland here, so many of my friends were from different parts of the world and all brought with them different belief systems that they practiced. And so however much you can get into it as kids, but talking about oh, we go to temple or synagogue or mosque and asking questions well, what's that? And I can remember kids asking me well, don't you go to church? And I was like, nope. And they're well, what do you believe? Don't you believe in anything? I was I guess not. But interestingly enough, there was this sense of me that was I had no idea about God or any of that kind of stuff. But part of me was hesitant to say that I didn't believe in God, because I was well, if there is some sort of thing out there, I don't want to be no, just in case, because my experience was
you didn't believe in me.
Exactly. And it wasn't because I was so this spiritual seeker as a 9-year-old. It's because I was well, if he's there, I don't want to piss him off. And that was kind of part and parcel for, I think, a lot of people's experience if they didn't grow up. But yeah, and then I found my way into it. I found my way into the Christian practice and tradition, and it's been an interesting journey, kind of the whole way through. So yeah. I don't know. I mean, I could just kind of kick it off and let you know, but if there's anything, you just tell me. I don't know. I'm usually the one asking the questions, so Desiree.
I know. Now you have to be I can just say everything that I have to say right now. And it's so interesting to me because I grew up sort of the opposite. So I'm Portuguese, and we're Catholic almost by culture. It's an interesting relationship. I feel pretty much everyone who's Portuguese says they're Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're all baptized in the Roman Catholic Church, but it does feel sort of like a cultural thing, more so that everyone goes to church. But I definitely remember, being a kid, and when we lived near my grandparents, we still went to church. And so it's that's where, I got to wear my hat, but then I also had to wear my stockings. I remember sitting in church just itching my stockings because you had to wear stockings to church. And for us, sort of that clear line, besides the stockings weren't enough. But my parents got divorced. And like instantly, you know, especially because it was still the 80s and, you know, I don't know what it's like now, but like in the Catholic Church, you aren't supposed to get divorced. And if you get divorced, you're actually supposed to have your marriage annulled in the eyes of the church. And that means that like my birth would have like been out of wedlock. And so my mom was just like, no. And like that was it. Like that was it for us in the church. And we sort of like never looked back. But I find it so interesting that even having that experience, like you always just feel like you're seeking something, you know, like throughout my life. And so like at what point, you know, not having grown up with religion in your home, were you like, I feel like something's out there. Like I feel like I'm looking for something. There's something more than just sort of like us doing our everyday things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, isn't it interesting that like we have this practice and tradition of like going to a building and we call it church, right? And then second of all, we have to like so there's somehow somewhere along the way like people decided you have to look a certain way, like you have to look
Yeah.
nice, like our Sunday best or
Yeah.
wear the itchy stockings, and it's like this whole thing that goes along with this spiritual practice of really just like coming together in community. But along the way, like we've made it into this whole institution really where not only, you know, kind of we can make light of like, oh, you know, or like the itchy Sunday school tight collar with the tie or stockings or whatever, you have to dress up. But we've also made it something where it's like there's a clear defined in-group and out-group, and there are some pretty significant things that can make you a part of that group or certainly outside of that group. And I mean, it just pains me when I hear stories like the one you just shared, Desiree, about your folks and like how, you know, an institution that's based on forgiveness and love and community, unconditional support for the community. And then there's all these unspoken,
Yeah.
unless you do this, unless you do that. And then I'm sorry, the community that is so significant and central to your life, you are no longer allowed to be part of it. And with something like divorce too, like, you know, most people don't get divorced just on a whim. Like things happen, people change, and it's never not painful. Even the most amicable of divorces, there's pain, there's loss that happens there. And again, like it kind of grieves me that the the church as an institution has, in someone's time of pain and need, has been like, yeah, sorry, you did this thing, so you're no longer, you know, part of our community. And of course, it's different. Like the Catholic Church still has, in some ways, like a harder line. And again, not all churches are the same. But I looked around at like certainly the church that I was leading, I would say like 60% of the people were either divorced or remarried or divorced and single. And I was like, yeah, let's go. This is life. Like you are welcome here. Right. And so anyway, as an aside, it's funny how we've made it something like stockings and Sunday best and rules about who can be in and who can be out. But to your question about how does a secular little guy running around in East Richmond find his way into the church, it wasn't because of any rules or regulations or things like that I was like, wow, I need more structure in my life to keep me on the straight and narrow. I simply became really, really curious about Jesus. I had, like I say, I didn't have Sunday school baggage. I had different baggage. So the church for me was something that was foreign and kind of, it spiked my curiosity. I think I've always been like a curious person. And I remember through high school becoming, like, my favorite band was, and arguably still is, in the top 5, Rage Against the Machine. And I just loved what they stood for, right? They were like these guys who were they have a song, Voice of the Voiceless, stood up for marginalized communities, elevated the stories of people who were hurting and desperate. And I was just like, I loved them. I loved their music. I loved their message. And of course, they reference all kinds of incredible social justice warriors before them, people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, of course, Gandhi, all of these people. And so part of my journey as a young person, learning about the world, and that I had a lot of privilege, and I had a lot of, my life was really charmed in many ways, and that how could I use that to help other people. I had this awareness even at like the age of kind of 14, 15, that I wanted to do something good in the world. And so through a project, a high school project, we had to look at people that were our heroes. And so I chose as my heroes Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi. And what I loved about them was that they changed their world. They completely turned the world upside down in like non-violent ways. And that to me was something that was so interesting, because anyone can start a riot, and anyone can, you hurt my friend or family, so now retribution, like I shall do the same or worse to you. Like that's the easy way out. And so when I looked at Martin Luther King, I just admired him as a man and as a leader. And same with Gandhi, that he would go to the lengths he did to try to bring about social change in India through these peaceful and nonviolent means. And so in this project, we were like researching these two people. And part of the project was like, who were your heroes? And so both, I mean, obviously, so for Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, like Jesus was kind of in his footnotes, his life biography, but also Gandhi had Jesus as this like person of interest. And so for me, I was like, okay, well, if they both like him and I like them, maybe that's someone I need to explore. And really, that was kind of the catalyst that started me looking into this character, this kind of rebellious Jewish rabbi from like 2,000 plus years ago, who has been made into many things since then by form and function of institutions and people wanting to make God in our own image, as we've always done. But yeah, I was just kind of captivated by this character and started pursuing it, wanting to learn more as like a 15-year-old. I was like the youth pastor's dream kid, where I like turned in off the street, was like shooting basketball, trying to find a girlfriend, and be like, oh yeah, by the way, like, can you tell me about Jesus? Like, so that was kind of my foray in. Yeah.
That's incredible. And I've heard you call Jesus the misfit, and I was really sort of drawn to this idea, particularly because, as you said, like, my understanding of church was this place that was very solemn and very hierarchical. And, we are all sinners and you repent. And there's just all of these rules and structures. And it made me feel that, sort of like God was this infallible and all-knowing and all-powerful being. And then Jesus was sort of upheld as, again, as sort of this perfection, personified on earth, right? And it puts this huge sort of like distance between us and God. And, hearing you talk about Jesus as a misfit, I was like, oh, okay. Like it changes the nature of how we perceive Jesus. And also, it's really interesting because juxtaposed in so many religions these days, and the things that are done in Jesus's name, which don't feel very Jesus-like, like how did we sort of like get this wrong? If Jesus was this misfit, if Jesus was, this person being like, hey, I'm doing something radically different than what was done before, like how did we sort of like get to this place where religion feels like it's creating and upholding a status quo?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, that's something that I think I think about all the time when I'm wearing like my kind of church like pastor guy hat. Is like, how did we get here? Like, how did we get so far from how this thing started? Because when you look at like the stories, the biographies about Jesus' life that are canonized in the Bible, right? Sometimes they're referred to as the Gospels, but they're really just like kind of snippets, like biographies about his life and the things that he did. And you look at the people who were most upset with him, and it was like the religious elite, because he was like disrupting the status quo. He was seen as like the Jewish term is like rabbi or teacher. He was seen as a spiritual teacher, and the teachings that he was giving to people were like setting them free from religious bondage, which is so painfully ironic that like today people use Jesus to wrap people up in religious bondage, to be like, here are all of the things that you can't do, that you can't be, the people that you can't love because XYZ rule. And like when you go back to the way that Jesus walked and lived, as much as we could hold him up as this like idea of like perfection, right? Like God incarnate, God made in flesh. But like you see, as much as you see the divinity of Jesus on display in these stories, like the humanity of Jesus is right there. And so to me, I was always just drawn to the fact that it's like, it's a both and. Like you can look at a story and be like, wow, like, geez, how could anyone ever be like that? Like he was Jesus, right? But then it's like you see this raw humanity of the man, and it's an invitation to live into that. And the whole story from the very beginning shows that like each of us, regardless of what we believe about God or the Bible or Judaism or anything like that, each of us has this like divine spark within us. It's something that we can't explain, where we search for truth, and we look at the stars and we're like, man, would there have to be more? Or I just feel so small. Or we, go through like a beautiful yoga pose and get into Shavasana at the end. And it's like this practice of being still and like almost practicing death. Like you work through the whole thing, and how do you just lay there peacefully at the end? So we're drawn to these spiritual things because I think that's baked into us. And so in Jesus, we see this reminder, this invitation to see that God and man, God and human can exist together. And I think the invitation there is for us to explore how to live into that. And that always creates more freedom and more love and more like generous space. And yet the tendency for the church has been to make it more narrow, like, and smaller. And that's just, to me, I don't know if I answered your question, but I just agree like that. It's so sad. And it's something that I think needs to be asked more. It's like, why does it look this way? Because even people who have never gone to church or never opened the Bible and don't know any of the stories about Jesus, most of those people can tell you when a Christian is not acting like Jesus. Because we kind of like, no, it's not being an ass. It's not like, wanting to be right and have your opinion matter more than someone's life or someone's well-being. And a lot of Christians would rather be right than caring. And I know that's a generalized statement, but unfortunately, like I've seen it, and it's very sad because I'm like, you don't look like the guy you say you believe in and you say you're trying to be like. There's a disconnect somewhere. And it's unfortunate.
Well, and we're just so flawed as a species as it is, and something that I always come back to is, from my perspective, that, religion is a man-made construct, right? So it reflects the people who create it and who create the institutions. And sometimes I think, being of European descent, why, when I sort of went down my seeking path, like I was really drawn to Eastern philosophies. And I think, not to say that, one religion or one philosophy is any better than any other, because I really don't believe that that's the case. But I think because when you're culturally removed, perhaps from the institutions and the sort of cultural trappings, the man-made trappings of that philosophy, like I found myself so drawn to Buddhism, like in my teens, like that's sort of where I went. And, and so many of those books are exactly that. It's learning about the Buddha and his life and his teachings. And, so I think that's so interesting that, perhaps if we don't grow up with religion, then we are a little bit more of a blank slate to be like, oh, like, who's this Jesus guy? He sounds like pretty cool.
Yeah.
He was that misfit. He was that sort of like rebel trying to stir things up.
Yeah, totally. I think, we often look at spiritual icons, right? Like the Buddha or Jesus, or even people more contemporary, the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu would be like the kind of modern day infleshed versions of those two things. And they're, they're revered, but at the same time, if we're paying attention, like they're stirring the pot. Like, Desmond Tutu, Archbishop in the church, and famous for being an advocate again for social justice issues, was one of the first significant voices within the structure of church who was like, no, we need to be like inclusive and welcoming of all people, regardless of like where they're from, who they are, and even like their sexual orientation, which is huge for the church. And I think it takes people like that to continue that kind of like fiery, rebellious spirit, because you don't often think of like church person or spiritual leader as rebellious, but like they are Gandhi, right? I mean, the teachings of the Buddha are so peaceful, and we often see it as like people sitting and floating like a lotus flower, but like those teachings are poignant and powerful. And if people started living into what the Buddha is inviting us to live into, or we live into the things that Jesus is inviting us to live into, like the world radically changes. And that's disruption, that's rebellion. It's like the status quo is derailed when people start to embrace loving kindness towards people who are different from them, whether that's from your Zen Buddhist cushion, or whether that's from your pew in your church. If you're committed to like standing up for injustice and stopping, again, like the status quo of the world, even like the industrial food mechanism that we all are suffering from, whether we participate in it or not, like those, once we become awakened to those harms and we say like no more, that you're embodying that kind of like religious or maybe more like spiritual rebellion that I think the world needs more of.
Well, and particularly now, because we've gotten into this place where everything is so divisive and feels so radical, and especially because like here in Canada, we absorb so much of like US media and US thought, and it used to be like Republicans, Democrats. Now it's like the radical left and like, like far right, like these small, like really intense groups who so often are, highlighting the differences between people, as opposed to the fact, I mean, like when we all come like flesh and bones, like genetically, like we are all just like literally like a hair in difference from each and every person. And so I find it so, I mean, distressing and horrible, but also so fascinating that like we as humans are choosing to focus on differences and like this like very black and white idea of like right, wrong, good, bad, when like all of this exists in every one of us. And I think there's so much potential for faith and spirituality and even organized religions to help create more sense of community, like to create those safe spaces. Like when we're seeing all of this media that is divisive and isolating, be like, oh no, here's a place where like everybody belongs. Like you belong here. Like you are welcome here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Desiree. And that's what we're all looking for and searching for. And I think sometimes it starts with like the people who are on the edges of society the most, because those are the people who are maybe most desperate for community and most in need of it, maybe not desperate, but in need of it. And so when we're on the margins of society, however we can understand that to mean, like that's where I think people might say, oh, those are the most vulnerable people in our society. But at the same time, like there's such a intrinsic power there, because typically like that is the most amount of people. Most of us are experiencing some sort of relational turmoil or longing within us to connect at a deeper level beyond just like, oh, how about the snow out there today? And like, did you see the sports ball game the other day? Like, right? It's great, but we are all looking for so much more than that. And I think that one of the beautiful things that spiritual community can give us is that sense of deep knowing and deep connection to ourselves and everything beyond ourselves, and especially those people around us, regardless of like where they're from, what they look like. Um, and I think that the beautiful thing that religion and spirituality can offer is that coming together around like a central source. There was a teacher that I had, and he talked about this idea of bounded set versus centered set, and I love it because so much of the modern church is what we would call like bounded set. So if you imagine like a beautiful field, a pasture, and there's all these animals grazing in the pasture, and the farmer or whatever is like wanting to make sure that none of them wander astray, then the farmer says, well, I have to build a fence. I have to build a fence to keep them in. Otherwise, they'll go somewhere else. And the neighboring farmer didn't like the idea of like building fences because there was so much beautiful land and places for the animals to explore, but also didn't like the idea of his animals like wandering off and going astray. So rather than building a fence, he created at the center of his land, like this beautiful well. It was like a natural kind of spring, and he created it so that it was a source of water and life, and knew that it was super accessible and that all of the animals, however far they would wander, would come back to this well because that was the source. And so when we think about that in terms of religious community, bounded set is like, here's the clear fence around the belief. And if you're on the outside of the fence, you're outside, and you've chosen to be outside the fence. You've hopped over, you've gone under, however it's happened, whether it's divorce, whether it's sexuality, whether it's alcoholism, whatever you could say, people who violate the rules go on the outside. But with centered set, you can't really tell who's in and who's out, because there's some people that are right close to the well, they're right close to the source, and then there's other people that are way far off, but like they're not out, they're just further away from that well, from that source. And in the centered set thinking, there are no ins and outs. We're all on this like journey and path together, and we're moving, some of us away, some of us towards, some of us are kind of just chilling way out there and no desire to move here or there, but there's this centered source. And when I think about like church communities or spiritual communities, like it's not the bounded set is easy because it's super clear who's in and out. And we like that. We like the black and white, good, bad, Republican, Democrat, right? Pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine. We like to know definitively like who's who, because then we can make a decision. Are we going to embrace them or are we going to other them? But with the centered set, that boundary of the fence is gone, and we just have to embrace each other as beings on this journey in different positions at the moment. Some of us moving away, some of us moving toward, like, and it breaks down those walls. And so that's where I would like to see like spiritual communities start to shift their focus and say, we're not going to have the boundary, we're going to have the centered, and allow people to experience that and move towards it, move towards the center, whatever that is, like in their own way and space and time. And we can be guides, there's spiritual teachers, there's people inviting us, provoking us, causing us to think, that might move us closer, it might move us away, it might kind of keep us where we're at. But nobody's ever considered like out or different or other. And that's really important, I think, to me to see in a spiritual community.
Well, and the idea that, like a faith-based community is inclusive and welcoming, it can be sort of that safe harbor, because I feel like we need it now more than ever before. Like, I think, when I think about like, getting this ripe old age of the over 40 club, like there's so many, for so long, you just feel like you're so bulletproof for so long. And then you survive enough like revolutions in the solar system, and you just realize like how much your soul yearns for very simple but very fundamental things, right? Like I need love. Like I want to feel loved and supported and cared for and connected to people too. And I think like the last few years just like highlighted that in the extreme. Like there was so many physical disconnects from people, but I think even just the act of like being on our phones all the time, like it really is isolating, even though I like the general intention was, to connect us all around the world, in a heartbeat. But I think it makes us all feel so much more disconnected.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. It's like that desire to know that, like, these feelings that I have and this longing for connection is like we all have it, but it's interesting that we and we'll acknowledge it, like, oh, like the pandemic was so hard and Zoom and all of these things were helpful, but they always fell short of like actually sitting down for like a cup of coffee, or like, well, come over for dinner, like let me make you a meal, let's just like go out and go for drinks or whatever it is. That all of those intermediaries like fall short of the actual thing, and we all know this, and we all like had this moment when it was like we can kind of be out in the world again, and we're all socially awkward, like, do we fist bump, do we handshake, do we hug, like what is the rules, what are we allowed to do? And I just hope that we don't like miss the opportunity baked into this to recognize that, like, man, we all want and need community, like in this real way. And that it's not just like some airy fairy, like, oh, it's nice to have friends that aren't just like Instagram friends or whatever, but like fundamentally, like I've been looking, in all aspects of life, like what creates like a healthy and a holistically well life, from the things we eat to the places we go, the water we drink, the all of the things. And like when we study, as Dan Bueter has done such a good job of like highlighting these blue zones where people can live, and they often live like to centurion age, like 100 plus or whatever, or just live long into life and live well. So it's not just longevity, but it's like a good quality of life as well. We look, and those pillars are like, healthy, good foods and meaningful relationships and connections, and exercise and being outside, getting connected to the sun and the wind and the waves and all of that stuff. And then also like spiritual community is one of those core tenets that kind of runs throughout the those blue zones. And to me, like, in the West, we're doing really good at identifying, like, what do we need to do to be healthy? Okay, like, what are some workout routines we can do? We have people like you who are reminding us to eat more plants, right? And like to be healthy, and have all of these like amazing resources of the internet and cookbooks and stuff to help us with that. And here's how to move, and here's how to invest in your partnership, your marriage, or whatever it is, right? Through therapy and all of this stuff. It's all out of our fingertips. And I think that what we're missing in a lot of ways is like meaningful spiritual community together. And if we want to go the distance and be like healthy people who live long and meaningful lives that can contribute to the world around us, like, I think we need to discover what that looks like and lean into it and embrace one another in like the awkwardness of being like, well, I don't know religion or spirituality, but like I have this longing, I have this desire, and I want to move towards it.
Yeah. And for someone who finds themselves in that place of longing, like what do you suggest, particularly for, some people who might not have even felt safe in sort of like traditional religious communities? Like how do they sort of like move towards that connection with God, like in their everyday lives? How do they find that community of like that safe harbor?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a story, one of my favorite stories, from scripture, if I can share it, if I can be that guy. But
Be that guy.
it's right after. So again, this is all, for your listeners, like notwithstanding that you need to believe any of this at all. So here's just a story about Jesus that I personally find deeply moving, and I've lived it myself. So after the Easter Sunday, where Jesus was tried as a criminal for disrupting the religious status quo, and he was executed for doing such by the religious people, really, in the state. There's this miraculous story of resurrection. So again, it's unbelievable. But so it's right around the December 25th, where Jesus wasn't born December 25th, just for the record, but it was a pagan festival that the Christians were like, well, we're going to take this one and make it ours. So there is no war on Christmas, because it can't be, because it's a pagan festival that Christians adopted. So go crazy, celebrate however you want. But anyway, I'm getting off track. So the whole birth, the resurrection, the whole story of Jesus' life is literally unbelievable. Like, virgins don't have babies and dead people don't come back to life. We just know this. And yet these are the bookends of this story of Jesus. And so we work with it. We work with what it tells us about life. But your question about people who, how do they want to move towards God or go back when maybe they've been injured or hurt, or wronged by people who are, in positions of spiritual authority. This story gives me great hope, and it's after Jesus was executed and then had come back to life, but people didn't really know exactly what was going on. He hadn't really shown up. Only a few women had seen him, which is a whole nother thing. The importance of women in the story of Jesus and how they've been silenced in the church for generations is very problematic. But these women had proclaimed it, but a lot of the men didn't believe them because patriarchy and chauvinism. And so these two disciples were walking away from Jerusalem where all of this action had taken place. They were sad, they were leaving, they kind of had put all this hope in this Jesus character, but like, he's dead, he was executed, and the story is done. So they were walking home. And it was about a 20-kilometer walk, so a good distance. And along this road, they're heading back to this town called Emmaus, and on the road back to Emmaus, this stranger kind of came up alongside them and said, "Hey, where are you guys going?" They said, "Oh, we're going back home." And he's like, "Why do you look so sad?" And they're like, haven't you heard what happened these last few days? Like, Jesus, we thought that he was going to be this like key leader, this person, Mashiach they called him, which is like a Jewish understanding of like a savior, but he wasn't. He was executed, and it's over. We're just heading home. And so they're walking along the road, and this stranger's like, "Well, what about this? What about when, didn't he teach you this? And I heard some of these teachings," and kind of like unpacked all of these stories from the Jewish, like the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, all the way up until like this moment where he was going to be executed by the religious authorities. And he's like, didn't you see this coming? Like, this was kind of all talked about for generations. And they were like, no. And so anyway, they get to their house and they're going to go in, and this character, this stranger that's walking with them, makes it look like he's going to keep going. The writer tells us it looks as though he was going to keep going, but then they were like, "Oh, hey, why don't you come in and like have a meal with us? It's getting late." So they go into their house and they invite this stranger in, and they sit down at the table, and they're just pulling together some elements. And there's this, they get some wine, and there's this loaf of bread, or the pita bread, or whatever it be. And the stranger sits at the table and takes the bread and starts to tear it. And when he's breaking the bread, they recognize that it's Jesus. And they're like, "What? How did we not know that it was you this whole time?" And as the story goes, he like vanished. And what was left behind was the bread, this memory, this thing that, Christians do, is like have this bread and wine as a reminder. And the reason why I share that story is because even when people are walking away, even when people are like walking away from the center of the action and feeling like it's all over, I was wrong, I'm done with it, Jesus is like saddling up alongside you, and like, I would say, wants to have relationship with you. Like, the fancy church word is like communion, like to eat and drink and to be together. And it's not because we got it all figured out. It's not because we believe right or we've done this good thing. Like, I love that this story takes place right away after this most significant event in the church calendar, really in church history, is that Jesus is like, yeah, these people who are like doubting and like unsure and kind of like leaving the scene, those are the people that I'm most interested in being with. And so I love that story, because it's that invitation to know that, yes, you might be leaving the church. You might be walking in the opposite direction of church. And like, I would say that Jesus is going with you, because a lot of times in my life, people the reasons why they are rejecting faith, or the reasons why they are rejecting this idea of God, is because it is the wrong picture or the wrong experience of what the thing should be. So in my opinion, the very best thing that they should be doing is rejecting that stuff. Because if someone were to give you a picture of God that is angry and petty and vindictive and out for vengeance before forgiveness, my goodness, the best thing you can do is say, there's no way in hell I'm going to believe that, and run, like go in the opposite direction, because like that is the best possible thing you could do. I mean, I'm not trying to like dump all over the church here, but at the same time, like, I've seen and know so many people who've been deeply, deeply hurt by terrible theology telling them that, God is mad at them or God is angry at them. And it's simply, it can't be true. If God is love, if God is this ground of being, this foundational energy of loving kindness and acceptance and embrace, then there can't be within that fear and anger. And all too often I see those things like creep in to the point of taking over, and it's all about do this or else. I'm like, that's just not the story. That's not the story.
And so if people are rejecting that, and like, what about prayer? What about meditation? Like, definitely here, in sort of like Eurocentric West, like we've really embraced the idea of meditation, which in and of itself, I mean, at one point it's a tool that exists for everyone. It's available to everyone. It doesn't cost you anything. Like, what a beautiful way to sort of like connect to spirit, to source, like whatever you want to call it, but then also sort of like divorced from the cultural and spiritual traditions. And there's a lot of sort of talk of, the appropriation of meditation as this sort of like Western wellness tool, divorced from, the very rich traditions and very rich cultures from which it originates. And, in our own sort of like Judeo-Christian, backgrounds and culture, like prayer is offered as that connection to God. Like, how does prayer differ from meditation? Is prayer meditation and meditation prayer? Like I don't think anyone has ever sort of talked to me about prayer in and of itself, other than that thing that you see on TV, which is normally someone like asking for something.
The wish list.
Like, please God, I really want that great exam grade, or
Yeah. It's so good. That's where like Western Christianity. It's funny. I love that you say like the Eastern, mysticism and Eastern practices, because like really, I mean, although it's like central and now we might think of it more Western, like Jesus was Eastern. Like he was Arab. Like if we saw him, we often think he's like from California, right? Because he's blonde hair, blue eyes, looks like he's out on his 6'10", catching some waves and like having an acai bowl and just like, yeah, bro, no problem. But he was like properly Middle Eastern. Like, it pains me to say it, but a few years ago, like he probably would have been selected for one of those random air quotes security checks at the airport, because his passport, something about his passport didn't look right. Oh, it was the photo. The photo didn't look right. And so, like we often mistake that like Jesus was Jewish. He was very, very Jewish. He didn't set out to start Christianity. Like that was never the intention. It was like a reformation of Judaism because things had gone astray. And he just like was one of many kind of prophets in a line saying, like, calling out the establishment, being like, you can't do it like this. You have all this like prayer and incense and offerings, but like people are starving and hurting. Like, who cares about the temple and the altar and this when like, yeah, people are hurting. Why aren't you helping them? And so Jesus came along and really upped the ante on that. But when it comes to prayer, I mean, I think you're going to get people who would say prayer is prayer and meditation is meditation, and they're different, and here's why. But for me, they've like really just merged into one thing. And I'd say from my experience, that's because they've always been the same thing. I used to have more, I guess like we would say like modern conventional prayer. That's kind of like the laundry list of like things you ask God to like intervene on. Mm-hmm. And that's like the most, as you said, like the most typical way that people pray. And it's not wrong. It's not anything bad about that. It's not like you shouldn't do that. A lot of Christian people there's like a verse that one of the apostle Paul wrote. He wrote letters to all of the early churches, kind of like giving them some help along the way as they establish their spiritual practices. And people take those today and read them, and they're great. But my biggest caution would be like, you have to remember that those epistles, like they all have funny names like Ephesians and Colossians and Galatians and all of these things. And it's just like literally communities that this guy is like writing letters to, being like, hey, here are some things to do. Maybe here are some things to try and stay away from. And they're conditional. They're like, to this church, to this church, to this church. And people often try today to take them as like foundational truth for all people everywhere. And that's where I think Christianity has got itself in a lot of trouble, because Paul, as this writer, wasn't writing to people in the 21st century. So I always remind people when I'm speaking or arguing with my contemporaries that when they want to like cite a verse, something 3:14 or whatever, and I'm like, okay, let's go to verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1. What does it say? To the church in Ephesus. Okay. So now make your point that you were going to make about the church in Ephesus. Because if you were going to make a point to our culture, to our moment right now, using a letter written at a specific time to a specific people, that's difficult. So using those letters, they are for us, but they're not to us. And that's an important distinction to remember when we're looking at that. And so there's lots of stuff about prayer in those letters. And people say there's one that says pray without ceasing, and it's this beautiful like cross stitch thing that your grandma like hangs on the wall. Pray without ceasing, and it just means you're supposed to be always praying. But really, it's just like a reminder to always be thankful and have gratitude, which is something we can all do. But in terms of meditation and prayer, my goodness, I have a hard time seeing them as two different things. Mother Teresa has, perhaps I can just quote her, and it will be the best way I can encompass it. Is she talks about, she has this phrase or this kind of like story where she says, when I pray, someone asked her about praying, and she said, well, when I pray, I don't say anything. And they said, oh, so what do you do? And she says, well, I sit and I listen to God. And so the person asking her said, oh, and what does God say? And she said, nothing. He just listens back. And to me, that's prayer and that's meditation. Yeah. That's sitting and that listening, equally so. Do you remember the show from like I don't know, maybe 15 years ago? It's called Dharma and Greg. Do you remember that show? It was like
yes.
a sitcom on TV.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And so she was in this like church. It was like in a hospital church, and one of her friends or someone from the show like had passed away, and she was sitting there and she was quite upset. And of course, of the couple, Dharma and Greg, if you don't know the show, you can just Google it. It was like the classic sitcom. But it had some redemptive qualities. But I just remember this episode, and this was even before I was like on the journey of like spirituality. I watched it, and she's sitting in this chapel, kind of like bereft and weeping. And all of a sudden, there's like a janitor that comes in, and he sits down behind her, and he's like, essentially kind of like a Morgan Freeman-esque character. He's like, young lady, what are you doing? And she's like, I'm praying, I guess. And he's like, well, how come you're doing all the talking or something? And she's like, well, I don't know. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? And he like leans back and he's like, well, I don't know about you, but if I was having a conversation with whoever created all of this, I sure wouldn't be doing the talking. And then, of course, she like opens her eyes and turns around to see this guy, and he's gone. And so it cheapens it a little bit maybe, but the premise is like prayer should just be like leaning in and listening. And sure, like we can say things, we can have affirmations, you can invite, intentions, or some people might call it manifesting. You really want something, or want to be part of something, or see something happen in the world. Yes, absolutely, bring that into your prayer time, into your meditation time with intention. But so many times I think people in the Christian tradition view prayer as like I can just like name it and claim it. Like I'll just sit here and pray for it, and then it will happen. And it doesn't require anything, any effort or any agency on my end. I don't think so. I think that's just wanting things handed to you. And the last maybe thing I'll say about prayer is that we often think about it as like a vending machine. So it's full of all of these things, and we go there with our like little prayer token, and we plop it in and make our selection A1. Right? And whatever I prayed for, the hickory sticks or whatever they are, fall down in the vending machine, and I open it, and away I go. I'm happy, right? And so we keep practicing prayer this way. I would like this, and we put it in, and we make our selection, and it may or may not fall, but we just keep coming back. And the problem with that is that, to me, like if you can just manipulate the system where you can pray a certain way, or pray enough, or be devout enough to always pray and ask for this thing, and you can pretty much know like, oh yeah, I'll put in my thing and make my selection and it will happen. Like to me, in that scenario, it's like you're not actually having any kind of encounter with the divine. Like any kind of God that you can manipulate that way just through prayer. I want this, and God will just give it to you. then in that scenario, like you are the one in control, and that can't be right. Like
Yeah.
that, I don't want to be in control of those kind of things. So we often misuse it, but I would just invite people, if they're like, how do I even pray? Like, honestly, just sit and be still and be quiet and focus on your breath. Yeah, there's a beautiful practice that I still do every day. Sometimes it's through my Othership app. Shout out to Othership. Great
Oh,
app
yes.
for
Oh,
breath
we'll
work.
put that one in the show notes. Yeah.
Right? Yeah, great app for breath work. Sometimes it's simply just on my own, like just focusing on my breath. And it evolved for me because it first started as something called the breath prayer. In the Hebrew language, God is not named. It's like a sacred thing. You can't give a name to God, because if you do, then you can kind of have like power over it. Like if someone calls your name, you look. Because in that moment they have so in the Hebrew tradition, God was too holy to be given a name, so they use these 4 letters. In English it's like YWHW, because its idea is that it's the unpronounceable name. So in the Old Testament you'll see like YHWH if it's written in English, and it simply means it's the name of God, but you can't say it. And some people thought like, oh, you can't say it because it's like bad. And then some scholars started investigating, and they're like, well, actually, you can't say it because it's like it's not a word that you can say. And they discovered that actually, if you were to phonetically pronounce the Hebrew name of God, it would sound like Yahweh. And so they're like, it's supposed to be like a breath. It sounds like to say the name of God is to breathe in and out. And I was like, oh my God, the first time I heard that, I was like driving and I like almost had to pull over, because I was like, that, of course. Because in the Hebrew tradition, God breathed the world and creation into being. That's like the Big Bang is like in those traditions, like God breathed and everything started happening. And then I thought about, I had recently had my second daughter when I heard this, and it's like they are birthed into the world. And the first thing everybody waits for is like that big and cry, that first breath. And I was like, oh, it's the first thing we do, and it's the last thing we do is say the name of God. And I was just like, that is so friggin' beautiful that it's baked into the very existence of who we are. We do it, I don't know how many times a day. But so for me, when I sit in the morning in the quiet and I just focus on breathing in and out, that's probably the most, I would say, deeply spiritual act that I do in my life, is simply sit and breathe and pay attention to the breath coming in and out, because that connects me to the source, the breath, the air, the everything, God, divinity, ground of being, however we name it. It's right there. It's right. It's in us. It's around us. We need it. Yeah. The breath prayer. It's beautiful.
Well, and it's just such a beautiful idea, because it then puts that connection back on us. Like it's possible for all of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we are, like that moment of connection, like we all have access to that, which I think is really beautiful.
Yes. And yeah, I mean, you'd asked earlier, like, how could people connect to God or to anything? I mean, you don't have to go to church. You don't have to go and I mean, in all honesty and full transparency, like it's hard for me to go to church because it's like some songs and, whatever. I know I used to do it. I used to like lead the music. I love music, but I'm like, this is not how it's supposed to be. I would rather just like sit quietly and breathe and stare at a candle and contemplate how can I love like the people in my world the best. And so there's no thing that you have to do. There's no magic, box to check. It's simply just being present and being aware and wanting to move towards what does it look like to be a more loving version of myself in the world. Like that's the work. That's the work. And of course there are churches and there are spiritual directors in the Christian tradition who will take a more mystical approach and invite you to consider the life and teachings of Jesus in a way that is beautiful and probably very different from like what mainstream church would. And so there's lots of great people that can be found and you can connect with. But in terms of like, yeah, how do you connect? I would say just sit and breathe and be aware.
Well, and I'll make sure I'll pick your brain, and we'll add some excellent links to the show notes so that if people want to seek more teachings and more learning, that they can do that. I want to
Yeah.
shift a little bit because we talked about loving kindness, and you mentioned even just sort of like the industrial food system that we are a part of, because you are plant-based. And, how does that fit for you? Like, how does that fit as part of your faith and your sort of
Yeah.
like connection?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was about it's got to be 5 years this January now. Um, I was taking my master's at a seminary in California, and the prof was like, "Okay, your task for this class, starting up in January, we're going to choose any section of scripture from the Bible, and I want you to read it as though you've never read it before. Like, try to forget all of your biases, try to forget everything you've heard about it and understand. I mean, it's a good exercise to do with anything, is like to come to something with the beginner's mind." And so it's like, okay, well, it's like new year, start over. I was like, I'm just going to go to the beginning. Like, I love the book of Genesis, like that. It's that first creation myth, how we came to be here, the story of everything. And so I was like, I'm going to start there. And I had been talking to our mutual friend, my podcast host, Zach.
Yeah.
They had just opened the juice truck here in Steveston. So I was there all the time drinking green juice and having smoothies and like toying with this edgy idea of becoming a vegan. And, so I said, okay, January, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try like the veganuary or whatever. And never went back. So there you go. It's not wasting away yet.
Still here.
Yeah. But I was sitting at the juice truck in Steveston working on this master's project, having my deep green juice, and started reading Genesis 1, the very first words you would read if you opened a Bible today. And throughout that, it talks about like this created order, this idea of like, it's the ideal. This is the intention of like what we should be. And it talks about this and that, this and that. And at the very end, it talks about how God creates animals and gives them all of this food, the plants and the seeds and the fruit to eat. And then God creates humans. And for us, God gives all of these plants and foods and seeds to eat, period. And it wasn't like, and animals to consume. And it just, because the idea of the project was like, come to it like you've never read it before. And it literally like jumped off the page where I was like, wait a minute. The intended order here looks like animals are not food, and all of these plants are explicitly named as, this is your food, this is what you will eat. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy, because I'm on this like journey of like, I'm going to try being vegan, and then having this experience of like trying to read something that I've read dozens of times, countless times before, and seeing it like for the first time, like, animals aren't food, like plants are the food. And then so I started going down this like nerdy deep dive on like all of the ways that, throughout the Old Testament, especially, like food was talked about, and which foods were, given, and and you cannot, this at the end of the day, you cannot make the case that people didn't eat meat in the Old Testament or even in the New Testament. Like Jesus ate fish, we know for sure. Mm-hmm. However, I started thinking about it because some of my Christian friends started pushing back on me. They're like, well, yeah, but like the Bible says, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, man, like, no, you got to like look at the heart behind it. And so people ate meat in the Old Testament because of the sacrificial system. And the sacrificial system was done so that people would stop hurting each other or sacrifice. Like child sacrifice was unfortunately all too common, not necessarily in like the tribe of Israel and the ancient Hebrew people, but in a lot of the surrounding nations, child sacrifice was like how you made sure God wasn't mad at you, which is crazy. But the animal sacrifice was, it's hard for us to believe, but it was almost like an upgrade to be like, no, stop sacrificing humans. And like, if you're going to do it, sacrifice an animal. But it's interesting because as we look at the sacrificial system, which many people would say God asked for this, if we keep following the chain back, like God never asked for sacrifices. And in fact, all of the Hebrew prophets that kind of came before Jesus telling people stop sacrificing and stop coming to the temple when you're like cheating your neighbor out of what he needs or you're not helping them. The sacrifices was never the idea. And so this whole introduction of like eating meat as part of the sacrifice was like never really part of the intended design. And so the more I looked into it, the more I was like, I just don't see a compelling case for eating meat. And certainly, if we fast forward to our moment today, like if Jesus were just to stroll up and be like, Dean, let's go for lunch. Like, I know for sure we wouldn't be going for burgers. I just know it because there's too much harm and injury that is attached to our industrial food system that it would be like, no, we're going to go for like Bestie Bowls at the juice truck. Right? And like, that's just how.
It's just so interesting to me. And of course, like the Seventh-day Adventists in their faith, they're vegetarian or vegan. And so, and I guess it all comes back to it's like we are humans interpreting this book and these stories that were written a really long time ago. And different people interpret things differently. And, the Seventh-day Adventists believe very clearly that they are not supposed to eat meat. Like that's not on the table. Like it's just not happening. And it's just this idea of, because I had a conversation with someone once actually, and she was such a lovely woman. And she was like, I see that you're vegetarian and I'm, it was back in the day, and I'm interested in this idea of not eating meat, but I don't know that it fits with my faith. And she's like, I'm Christian. And I believe as a Christian, we're taught that the animals are here for our purposes, and so we are supposed to eat the animals. And I was like, I didn't know how to answer that because I wanted to, show respect for her faith, but also that it's like, I can't imagine that, you would be forced, like this idea that you would be sort of like forced to kill animals as part of your devotion to faith. Like it didn't make sense to me. And, I think at the end of I think I just sort of like left that conversation to being like, you have to follow what's in your heart. Like that's all that any of us can do. And I think what I offered was that just like, it doesn't preclude you from eating more vegetarian meals or like, having some meals that are only plants, if you feel that it's really important to you to eat animal flesh. But yeah, it's, we're all just here trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's the two words that are really problematic in that, even in that kind of opening chapter, Genesis 1, like it's online. You can read it for free if you're ever interested. It'll take you about 4 minutes, but you can read the first chapter of Genesis, and the two words that are problematic are rule and subdue. That God gave the world over to people to rule and subdue. And so well-intentioned, that people who would otherwise be like super environmentalists are like, no, like the world is ours to like rule over and subdue, to like conquer. But I think that those translations like are lost a little bit, because if we look contextually, like the only model for like ruling over that exists when those words were like penned was like God. And so the idea is that like that author was writing in like, this is what it looks like to rule over. And it's like creative and it gives itself over. It's like the plants and all the stuff, like it's created and then it's allowed to do its thing. It's allowed to flourish. And there's so much diversity and there's so much creativity within it. And so for us to then be like, oh, well, it's our job to rule over and subdue. So far, all we've seen is like beauty and positivity and creativity and like generativity. And so for us now, what that means is like, eat all the animals. Like it's just kind of a big leap. But so many of us, especially people raised in the church, like that's what you're taught. Just like that person you said, like, oh, I was taught that the animals are here for us to eat and like rule over and enjoy. And that's what God wants for us. And when you're taught that from, the very beginning, that's a tough thing to peel back. And we know that food is sacred, whether we are sacred people or not, right? Whether we have any practices, like food is central and sacred to us. And so it can be a big one to overturn. But for me, I was just like, man, it's kind of like a no-brainer. Like, I don't think we were ever intended to live this way. And certainly not 2023, how we're living with these systems.
Well, and that's so central for me too, is this idea of evolving, right? Like we are not meant to be the people we were 10 years ago. Like if we are, we're doing something wrong, And this idea that as our world changes, we respond in kind. And I was reading in the paper this weekend how, a lot of people were talking that we're living in the Anthropocene, right? We're living in the time of humans. And, but scientists right now are actually debating and determining when exactly is the Anthropocene. So, because we've been living in the Holocene. And so, potentially 70 years ago, is the moment that they're going to mark when 2.5 billion people hit this planet, because that is the moment with which humans started. Like if we talk rule and subdue, like when we really dramatically started changing what life on this planet looks like. The idea being that, if you were a human on this planet 200 years ago, it would feel so wild and so vast, like nothing we could do as humans would change it. But now it's very clear, like the impact of our actions. And if we come back to this idea of loving kindness and even just being good stewards of this land, you're like, we have to shift, because people would be like, oh, well, like, we were meant to eat meat and we would have died 200 years. Yeah, but that was 200 years ago. Like we didn't have like all these supermarkets with all this great food. We also had a heck of a lot more rainforest than we do now. So it's like, how can we shift, right? Like, how can we actually like embody more of that kindness and that good stewardship towards, even if we're not ready for other people yet, like at least this land, most people can be like, nature's a pretty cool thing. If they're like, I don't know if I'm ready to love my neighbor yet, but nature's awesome. Trees are wicked. So are flowers. It's like, okay, so we can do this.
Yeah. I think it's tied to like a fundamental teaching too, in the church, which is one of those things that's kind of, it's become bigger than the whole thing, which is this idea of like, stop people on the street and like, why do you go to church? And they may say, oh, like I like the music or blah, blah, blah. But fundamentally, most people are there as like kind of an insurance policy, right? Like, well, I don't really know if it's like God, like if there's 100% honest, I don't really know if like God is real, but I don't want to go to hell when I die. Like it's this fear, or alternatively, it's like I want to go to heaven, so I'm gonna like go to church and like help at the bake sale and stack the chairs and do the things because like I want this for the afterlife. And it's fascinating to me because nobody knows. Like nobody actually knows what happens when we die. And it's like that's almost like scandalous to say in like Christian circles, because they're like, well, no, we do know. And it's like, well, let's look at like the book and see what it has to say. Really not much.
Wow.
Like Old Testament, there's a little bit more, but Sheol was like this resting place for people who were good and bad. So it's not like one or the other. So that kind of like kiboshes the whole like heaven and hell and be good and go to heaven and be bad and go to hell and all this stuff. And the fundamental error in all of this emphasis that I would say from like the 80s till even into now, this emphasis that was put on like, you gotta believe this way and live this way so that you stay out of hell, or sometimes it was positively framed, but not as often as it was negatively framed, so that you can get to heaven. But regardless of how it was framed, whether it's like fear of hell or invitation to like experience heaven, it's fundamentally missing the whole point, because we have this Genesis creation of the planet, the earth. It's here, it exists, it's absolutely stunning. And many Catholic mystics would call it the first incarnation of God. So the first kind of like God becoming something that's like in and around and all over, to like being, we can see it and touch it. They would say that the earth is the first incarnation of God, which I absolutely adore that thinking. The more I kind of grow in my own journey, it's like nature and God, I think they're the same thing, which whatever will get me in trouble, but that's fine. I'm happy to be in trouble. But people who are told everything you do matters because of your afterlife, then it's like the emphasis is not on the here and now. The emphasis isn't on caring for your neighbor because genuinely you just want to care for them and wish good for them. It's not that loving kindness, like I want what's best for you. It's like, oh, I'll be nice to you so that I can end up here. And it decentralizes our connection to the earth. And so I would say that Christianity has some culpability for sure in in the planetary crisis we're at, because so many people in the West who were powerful decision makers were raised in the church where the emphasis was placed not on the here and now, but the emphasis was placed on what happens when you die. And we just don't know. And so we made real world decisions that impacted and are impacting for generations how we lived, because, well, it's all about getting to heaven anyway. So like the earth is this commodity that we can rule over and subdue and use. And like, I mean, it's kind of inconsequential. What matters is, are we going to get there? Have we done good spiritually so we can get there? And it's crazy because saying it, I'm like, I don't know how you can't see that like not caring about the earth actually is getting in the way of this thing that you think you're pursuing anyhow. But the fundamental focus is like on these spiritual things, on this afterlife, rather than the here and now. And again, for me, I'm someone that always goes back and says, let's look at Jesus. If he's the person you're believing in and wanting to model your life after, well, he showed up once when he was born. He spent a whole lot of time walking around talking about creation and caring, and was so connected to the earth around him. There's so many stories that are like Jesus was like a hippie. Like we talk about grounding, like this guy, he put mud on people's eyes and they could see. Like it was crazy. All of these stories of connections to the earth. And then he dies and comes back in case the first time wasn't validation enough that this is what matters, that the here and the now is what matters. Like he comes back to remind us like, yo, here, this is the thing. This is the story right here, right now. Okay. And now it's your job to care for and grow and carry this thing forward and allow it to progress and change and be more and more radical as the years go by. And like so many people have missed that central point, that it's like, this matters. And so like, in my opinion, Christians should be like the number one environmentalists. And yet they're not. And that's so sad for me. But
I feel like that's the mic drop. There's so many. I honestly want to talk to you for like 3 more hours, but that just means we're going to have to do this again. And I'm going to make a very non-subtle shift to the rapid fire questions, which
okay,
is
let's do it.
how I close every episode of the podcast. So, because we didn't really talk about like fatherhood except for like that one moment. So like, what's the best thing about being a father?
Oh my gosh. I think seeing the world through like my kids' eyes and just being open to like play and silliness. And just unlearning things as they teach me stuff is so good. My daughters are 6 and 9, so they're at a really fun age right now. And yeah, I think just seeing the world through their eyes is the absolute best. It's such a treasure. I love being a dad.
Such a gift.
Yeah.
Sharp right turn. What you eat when you need an immediate energy boost?
Ooh. It's usually, I'm just thinking like I'm a high school teacher as well. So sharp left turn. But usually when I get home, it's like actually, I think it might be one of your recommended little story recipes. Now that I think about it, it's like I'm gonna do you a solid because it's true. Silver Hills, the high protein bread.
Yeah,
that's the one, right? The orange bag or whatever in the toaster, and then it comes out, and I put either tahini or like sunflower butter because I'm a no nut vegan, and then hemp seeds. That's like my go-to. It's got like the carbs, the protein, the fats, and then it kind of ties me over till dinner. Like I can get a little run in or workout, but that's the go-to snack. And I'm pretty sure that was one of your things that I saw in your story.
We are always on brand on this podcast. Always. I mean, we also need a whole thing on like no nut vegan. That's another one we have to unpack. Yeah. Okay. So you also host one of my favorite podcasts, A Little More Good, with our mutual friend, Zach. What's been your favorite moment of the podcast so far? Like whether it was like actually an episode or just a moment where you're like, oh, we're doing this and this is awesome.
Yeah. It was either going to be the first or the second time you were on the pod.
Aw.
No, I don't know. That's a really good question, Desiree. I don't know off the top of my head if I can think of like one singular moment. I mean, there's been so many. May Globus like did a sound bath in my living room here with us when she was on the podcast. which was absolutely incredible. It's the first time I've ever experienced it. Equally, like Juno Kim, he's been on a couple times and just like leads us through some meditations before and even after the podcast. But so those are kind of like standout things. But I think honestly, the thing that I love the most is like the pre and post pod, just like conversation with all of the guests. Like with you, with Akeem, like so many amazing people. So it's all a gift, as you know. Yeah.
I mean, it's so funny to talk about connections so much. And like, one of the things that I love most about doing a podcast is that, especially because like my temperament, we didn't even get to talk about Enneagram. That has to be another whole thing too. Like, I'm really bad with small talk. Like, I instantly want to go there. I'm like, hey, I just met you. What is your life philosophy? And like, what's the worst moment of your life? And like, how did you bounce back from that? Like, it's just such an incredible opportunity to connect with people and have like really meaningful conversations that, again, we don't sort of always do in our regular life anymore. There's just so much surface, and we get to like instantly go beyond that for this, which I really love.
Yes, so good.
All right, 2 more. Okay. Tofu or tempeh? Easy one.
Ooh, tofu all the way.
Okay. And then the next place you want to visit on your bucket list?
That's a good one. The list is long. I think my wife and I have talked about Italy next. That's kind of like, I think that's where we want to go. And then watching White Lotus recently, I've been like, yeah, it seems pretty beautiful. Maybe not that hotel, but
yeah. Not that hotel. Don't get on a certain boat, you know.
Yes. But I think we've talked about that for like maybe a milestone anniversary or something. And it just seems like a great place to go. So I would say,
amazing.
Yeah.
Dean Morris, thank you so very much. You are a treasure, and I am very lucky to know you.
Well, likewise, Desiree. Thank you for the opportunity to come on and share. And I hope that it was meaningful, and that your listeners, if you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you. And I guess maybe as a little bit of a sign off, I know lots of people have been really, really hurt deeply by the church. And for whatever it is worth, as someone who represents that establishment still in whatever capacity I may, please accept my deepest apology for any wrongdoing or pain that was caused to you in the name of Jesus, for sure, and done in the institution of the church, the place that should be the most loving, compassionate, and wide open place there is. So if you are someone who has been hurt, I am so sorry that has happened to you. It should never have happened. So please accept my deep apology on behalf of this institution. Yeah.